What a paradox. During precisely the period when deconstruction, multiculturalism, new historicism, and translation studies swept the university, the practice of translation itself was marginalized to the point that, as Gayatri Spivak succinctly put it at a colloquium at Columbia University a couple of years ago, the great scandal of translation is the obliteration of the figure of the translator. And I'm actually very excited to go to a panel later this afternoon about precisely the figure of the translator, because I think we need to really reconstitute that figure very strongly. We can now take a moment to imagine ourselves struggling with Sinliki Ununi to find the Akkadian or Middle Babylonian equivalent of the expression to throw the baby out with the bathwater. How could the universities have so utterly failed to take seriously the ideas that academics were writing books about and teaching to their students? I know I don't need to offer much evidence for the U.S. university's turn away from the practice of translation to our present audience, especially given that ALTO, with its extremely valuable publication on translation and tenure, has been the leader in the struggle to defend translators from this particular form of obliteration. And the question of why in so many U.S. universities, even today, even with the changes that have recently taken place, and I'll get to those, the publication of a translation is, for the most part, discounted altogether at worst, and at best given less weight in tenure consideration than the publication of a work of criticism, is not one that I have been particularly eager to address. For that question itself has come in for a certain degree of derision among people for whom I have a great deal of respect. Tenure for translators, snorted the poet Sam Hamill contemptuously when I once broached the topic in his presence. Over the course of his career, Hamill has, to name just a few of his achievements, founded Copper Canyon Press, a major force in the publication of poetry and translation, translated from ancient Greek, Latin, Estonian, Japanese, and Chinese, and led a movement of poets against the Iraq War, all without benefit of tenure. Indeed, in many circles, the phrase academic translation is a term of opprobrium, referring to the kind of plodding and heavily footnoted rendering, entirely off-putting to readers seeking a literary experience rather than a dry investigation, that is associated with translations produced by college professors. For many, the compelling question isn't how to validate the practice of translation within the university, but how to take translation away from the university altogether and thereby save literature from dull pedantry and keep it alive. Furthermore, it's perfectly clear that no one who wants a lifetime guarantee of full salary, pension, and golden parachute like a civil servant or a corporate CEO should engage in any literary or scholarly endeavor of any sort. Indeed, we've all just seen that even careers in finance have their serious risks. Many of the most worthwhile pursuits, obviously drama, music, fiction, poetry, any sort of serious writing, including translation, routinely oblige those of their practitioners not in possession of some form of wealth to have a day job on the side in order to earn a living. At a time when 70% of all teaching at the college level is in the hands of adjuncts, many of whom are so poorly paid that they're forced to support their passion for teaching with other forms of employment, the question of why the practice of translation has been marginalized by the tenure review committees might seem merely self-interested and not terribly relevant. And when we consider that the Iraqi translators who worked with the US military after the invasion were often targeted for death, and nevertheless were, until a couple of years ago, refused asylum by the very government they'd risked everything to help, the question seems even more trivial. To step outside of your own culture to a place midway between it and another is to take a big risk. All translators know that, and they know that translation is far more important than the question of the status of the translator or of translation itself within the publishing industry or the academic world. Far too important to be left to the tenure review committees or the marketing departments of the publishing houses. However, the question assumes real urgency when viewed in the context of the diminishing role of translation within U.S. cultural life. That role came in for some serious international consideration earlier this month when Horace Engdahl, permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy, which gives the Nobel Prize, said in a press conference, the U.S. is too isolated, too insular. They don't translate enough, and they don't really participate in the big dialogue of literature. There are only two entities that have the power to dramatically increase U.S. participation in that big dialogue: publishing industry and the universities. And that's why, with all apologies to Sam Hamill, we really do have to address the relationship between the practice of translation and the getting of tenure.